We continue to hear from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, where he says, "You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Amen. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." The gospel of the Lord. You may be seated. So we're moving through Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, right? In Matthew, it's chapters 5, 6, and 7. Right? Last week, we had the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount in the Gospel, which was the Beatitudes, first 12 verses. So Jesus begins the teaching by talking about there are people who are in need. That's the first 4 Beatitudes. And then the next 4 are the people who help those who are in need. Right? So that's the first 8. But then we get to verse 9. And Jesus says, "Blessed are you when people revile you, spit on you, and try to kill you in my name. Rejoice in that day." Right? And then he moves on and he says why we should rejoice. Because these are the next verses. He says, what? You are the salt of the earth. You're the light of the world. Right? And Mrs. Kenzie, my 7th grade English teacher, right? 7th grade for us was when we went to the blackboard and had to conjugate verbs, first person singular, second person singular, third. Remember? Right? And then we had to learn all the tenses. And what we see in this you is that it's in the emphatic. Now, what does that mean? Well, Mrs. Kenzie would say, it's not just you, but it is better translated, you and only you. You and no one else are the salt of the earth. You and only you. You and no one else are the light of the world. You and only you. Right? It's the same thing in the Beatitudes, right? That same emphatic you. The blessed are you when. Because what Jesus is saying is, If you don't help those who are in need, ain't nobody going to do it. The world certainly isn't. Because see, what the world does is the world sees those who are in need and those who are helping those in need as the same. And they don't like either of us. Which is why they what? Verse 9. Try to revile us and say things about us and try to kill us. So you and only you, if you're not doing it, it ain't going to get done. Wow. So I'm like, well, okay. So he's laying on us that I'm salt. Well, what does that mean? Biblically, what does that mean? Right? Because my doctor says I shouldn't be salt. Right? So I'm like, I should probably look at this salt thing, right? So here's what I found. Salt back in the day, right? This is what they used for it. Job 6:6 says that salt is used for seasoning and flavor. Right? Leviticus 2:13, we hear the salt of the covenant, giving a perpetuity, a foreverness to the offerings in which it's mixed. So they would take salt and mix it with the offerings, and it would give it this lasting foreverness. Right? Exodus 30, salt was used as a purifying agent to make things clean and holy. 2 Kings 2, a bowl of salt is used for purification. Ezekiel 43, they throw salt on offerings to consecrate them. Ezra 4 tells of the sharing of the palace salt as a sign of loyalty. That when kings would make treaties, they would get the palace salt, which was the best salt, of course, and they would throw it down as a sign of loyalty to the promise that was made. Ezekiel 16, salt was applied to newborns. Numbers 18, salt symbolized the healing purity and fidelity of God's covenant with Israel. Sharing salt, eating together, expressed a binding, meal-like quality of relationships. Salt was used for the fuel in earthen ovens, so that if the salt didn't catalyze, it was thrown out. As Jesus reminds us, what we see is salt doesn't exist for itself. Salt exists to be added to something else. You are the salt of the earth. That means all that stuff is what you and only you and no one else are to be doing for this world. Because you are the salt of the earth. And if we don't do it, if we're not out there consecrating the earth, if we're not out there symbolizing loyalty and purity and cleanliness and devotion to God, if we aren't out there making things holy, no one else is going to do it. You and only you is what Jesus is saying to us today. Right? And he says, you are the light of the world. You and only you, the light of the world. Now, this passage of Scripture leads absolutely to my most favorite thing I ever do in ministry. And I've told you, my most favorite thing to do in ministry is baptisms. And the most favorite moment of that most favorite thing, right, is, right, so they come up, whether they're adults or children, they all get angry when I get them wet, right? Even the adults get a little puffy, right? So they're angry. And then I put oil on them, and they get angrier. And then I say the prayer, the spirit of wisdom, understanding, spirit of counsel, might, knowledge, and fear of the Lord, and I put my hands on them, and they're, right? But then, I pick up the candle, and I go to the Paschal candle, and I light it. And then I walk up to that little baby, that's what I see. And they go, right? And I say, let your light so shine before others that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. And then I go to hand it to them and then hand it to somebody else. 'Cause you know I'd hand it to them, but you know. So you already right now, you and only you are the salt of the earth, the light of the world. And it's up to you to light this dark world. Because if we don't do it, we're all going to wander around in darkness. Now, the other half of this emphatic form in the you is, I just told you, it's you are already right now the salt of the earth, light of the world. It's not something that's going to happen to you someday. You already right now are. You see, when that person comes to the water, they already right now are the light of the world. It's not when I give them the candle. God already did that. So there ain't no excuse about our saltiness or lightedness. We already right now are. And if we don't use that, that's that whole, if salt isn't going to be add and do all that stuff, then we throw it away. Who would hide their light under a bushel? So we're supposed to hear that we shouldn't be doing that, is what we should hear when Jesus says that. Right? You see, here's why we're in year A in the lectionary, right? Which is predominantly the Gospel of Matthew. And we as Lutherans struggle this year with the gospel readings. Because as you've learned from me, each of the four Gospels has a theology. It's distinct individual theology. For Matthew, it is your righteousness and what you do in this world that will determine your salvation or not in the next. For Matthew, it's not about grace. It's about what you do. That's where we get to the end, right? He says at the very end, check me if you're playing the home game. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. If we're not going to be salty and lighty, Matthew doesn't think our chances are very good. Now, it's a good thing we got more than just Matthew for Gospels. And we do find grace in other places. But at least when Jesus is saying here, he's explaining, this is what the Sermon on the Mount is all about. It's about what we should be doing as people who claim to be kingdom people. And then the rest of the book is about what the kingdom is supposed to look like here and now, which is why we should be doing what we're doing. Right? We got to be the light of the world and the salt of the earth. And when do we taste that saltiness? When do we taste it? In our blood, sweat, and tears for the kingdom. That's when we taste our saltiness. Right? It's at the darkest moments that we realize just how much light we really do have. You already, right now, you and only you are the salt of the earth. You and only you are the light of the world. So I'm going to give you a couple pocket remembrances so you don't forget. Fair enough? Right? So, take some and pass it on. Take some and pass it on. Salt packets. Carry with you in case you need a little saltiness in your life. Take one, pass it on. It's a big match in case you need to light your own fire. Because, brothers and sisters, here's the realness. The world depends on us to do what we should be doing. Because if we're not going to do it, ain't nobody else. God expects us to do it. Now, I'm an Army guy, but some of us have hung around some salty sailors. I don't know if there's any in the house right now, but ooh. Right? Now, I'm not saying you got to be that salty. But we got to add a little flavor. It's us that adds the consecration. It's us that adds the holiness. It's us that is the salt of the earth. God knew you from before you even existed and called you beloved. Lit the spark inside of you that God promises God will never let burn out, and has filled you with flavor upon flavor to go out into this world and make it the kingdom that God expects it to be.